We used to take it for granted, to be honest, that the birds that you saw would always be there.
30 years ago, when you could go out on the cliffs here and see puffins quite easily. You went out in the boat and you saw puffins. And it's a bird that all people, young and old, seem to identify with and find amusing. And it's quite possible that Manx children won't be able to see puffins.
They're no longer there, so they don't know what they are missing, do they? That's probably could be said about a lot of things. They don't actually know what they are missing.
It's tomorrow's generation that are going to ultimately have to be the ones that are going to inherit all of this, if inherit it at all. And so, if they lose that connection, how are they going to even care about it? You know, we may as well be doomed as a species now.
Well over 100 seals on the rocks and in the water. And it's a magical feeling. It's certainly not the same as sitting in your house at home watching it on television, even though you feel you know all about it when you've seen it on television. But to actually be there and see it for yourself, and to see the seal's head pop up out of the water and look you in the eye, and they do, and you feel that you're a part of nature because of it.
When I grew up in Douglas, there were butterflies all around you. And as a child, I remember I actually drew the life history of the small tortoiseshell butterfly, from finding the eggs, the caterpillars, the pupae and the butterflies within a couple of hundred yards of my house in central Douglas. And you just accepted that that was the way it was, but you could just go out and find these things.
The beautiful thing about the Isle of Man is, I remember once looking at a map from the Isle of Man, and I can't think of anywhere where you were more than 5-minute walk from a green space. Now, has children's roaming area got so short now that they can't access these spaces and see and enjoy these spaces? I think it probably has.
We grew up in a family that we went out to parks and places and looked at wildlife and birds and things. So my dad, I'm following from what I learnt from my parents basically, that was get out in the outside and look at things, climb trees and generally cause a nuisance.
We go up to Fenella Beach in Peel, and you could go in there and we dive in there, and with a little bit of effort you could collect a couple of dozen large flatfish to eat. If you go up there now, you could swim up and down all day and you wouldn't see one.
When I was young, up Clabane wasn't built on. There was just Stella Maris, the house on the top left by the hairpin. But otherwise there was no building up there. There was a farm, but you could walk up through the fields to the hill, or up to Albert Tower if you wanted, but it was sort of rather wet meadow. And as a child I used to like running through the long grass, and there used to be always butterflies flying up in front of me. When I came back and found it was being built on, I was absolutely devastated, because that was part of my playground, as it were. In the 1940s we did have better summers, and it was always the sign of summer when the swifts arrived. They were fascinating because they flew so fast, and they were different from other birds, the way that they screamed. But the lovely scimitar-shaped wings and the marvellous flying up and down, because Parliament Street is quite a narrow street, so they echoed the sound of them. And then they flew in a mass. They'd fly across the harbour and back. But they always seemed so excited. So when I came back to the island in 1970, I can't remember seeing any swifts then.
When I was a child, you almost kicked out the door at 8 o'clock in the morning, and if you came back for tea, then all well and good. So there's far less pressure on parents. And again, the parents seem to appreciate that there was not much danger in doing that, and also allowing the child to get wet, get muddy, pick up things that move and wriggle. There seems to be a lot of fear around these days, which prevents parents from letting their children go, if you like, and just experiment and discover things. I think the saddest thing is that it's very hard to communicate what it was actually like, because people tend to look at what exists when they're born and grew up, and as if that's normal. But I do find it difficult to communicate just how rich wildlife was back perhaps 40 years ago.
We particularly like to look for the sea anemones, the little round red buttons, and when the water washed over them, you'd see them open up into a flower. I find it very, very sad that they're not looking, and even if they were looking, there wouldn't be the same things for them to see.
I remember one big crab we got out from Perwick Bay was so big. Now my family are fairly lead and whatever, but holding the crab by its claws, my father could put it round the claws round his waist, so it was gigantic.
The spider crabs that I studied, they live in the subtidal areas, so I was working in depths of sort of from low water down to about 40 metres mostly, and they were common. So we went back to the areas where we'd worked before and discovered they'd become pretty scarce, and we had to work very hard to get the rather small numbers that we needed for the work. And the reason for this, of course, was the scallop dredging. The effect of the scallop fishery is rarely to plough the seabed. And the crabs I was interested in, they depended on the roughness of the seabed and the little things growing there for them to feed on and to cling on to. So as a result, the scallop fishery had decimated the populations.
There appears to be no crabs now, no edible crabs coming in. I haven't seen anybody down crabbing for a number of years. Last time I went crabbing was about 12 years ago, and on good tides there was absolutely nothing. And going back to the holes where you used to know where there were crabs coming in, so there definitely is a dearth of inshore crabs.
It's sad to say it, but I had a great enjoyment in fishing around the Isle of Man when there were, what I would say, were there good numbers of fish in the sea. And to look at it now, the comparison is incredible. I certainly remember huge shoals of mackerel alongside the Victoria Pier, extending out as far as you could see, extending downwards in the water as well, so not just on the surface. And I know some people sometimes say there were so many fish you could walk across the backs of them, but had it been dry, you could actually have done that. They were so thick in number.
It's going back to when I used to go fishing with my father, those fish stocks appeared to be inexhaustible, certainly rod and line fishing. But I think time has proved that in fact that's no longer the case. In recent years, those quantities of mackerel we're catching around the Sugarloaf, Calf of Man area are definitely reduced to than what there would be 10 or 15 years ago.
Originally, herring were sustainable. They were caught by drift nets, which are hard work and don't take the herring in solid numbers. They take a proportion of the catch. But once they started using ring nets and echo sounders and things, they could detect a shoal of herring. The boats were larger, more powerful, the nets were enormous, and you could just fish out the whole shoal of herring, and in the evening and that's why the population disappeared.
Going back into the 60s and the 70s, there would be oil spills with tankers washing their tanks out after delivering crude oil. This was on the surface of the water, and particularly the auks, the razorbills, the guillemots and the puffins would get their oil on the feathers, which they'd ingest and basically used to kill them. One
of my favourite birds is the greenfinch, and I can remember seeing my first greenfinch when I started feeding birds in the centre of Douglas. It's not a common bird these days. And there are other birds as well. I remember seeing large flocks of lapwings down by Ronsley Airport, and again, fairly rare bird on the Isle of Man these days. So it doesn't matter whether it's birds, bats, insects, fish, everything has decreased absolutely drastically in numbers.
When I started driving, I used to get an awful lot of insect spattered on the windscreen, and Father, when he was driving regularly, we went out for picnics. When he came back, there was masses of dead flies and all sorts of things spattered on the windscreen. There were always flocks of lapwing. We could always tell them with their rather strange shaped wings broader out, and as they turned, you catch the light the one way and not the other. But they were all in all the fields. At the end of the war, they were still ploughing with horses, so we'd get lapwing particularly, and seagulls, unspecified seagulls following the horse and plough.
It was just an accepted thing that most people would go out and get a little bit of frog spawn to rear. And at primary school, every year you would have frog spawn in a tank in the schoolroom. But it was fantastic to learn from, because if you got it at the right time and it was fairly freshly laid, you can see the egg begin to divide, you can see it change shape within the jelly, you can watch the tadpole develop its gills, and then the gills retract inside the body, it begins to swim and it grows, and then you get that marvellous transformation at the end where the rear legs appear, and then one front leg appears, and then the other front leg appears, and it just, before your very eyes, day by day, turns from a tadpole into a frog. And it's incredibly sad that children, generally speaking, can't experience that, because there's nothing like experience and watching something like that to generate your lifelong interest in wildlife.
If children, and I think all the evidence suggests that this is the case, are going to lose that connection to the wider world, the natural world, then how on earth are we going to ever do anything to preserve it, to restore it?
Wildlife is a complete barometer of the health of the planet. So if we as human beings, we are the most destructive creatures that have ever been on the earth, have also got the ability, using common sense, hopefully to be able to do our best to maintain the wildlife of this world.
I think the great loss is something that they won't be able to perceive, but they don't know how good it was in times gone past. You'd like to think that they could now experience things getting better. I've had the experience of seeing things almost at their very best, but deteriorating throughout my lifetime. And I suppose my biggest wish would be to see the children of today see things improving, so that when they're giving a similar interview in 40 years' time, they can say, it used to be awful, but now it's much, much better.